All right, John chapter 4. John chapter 4, as we pick up in our second week on looking at the miracles of Jesus, we pick up in chapter 4, and a lot has happened between Jesus' first miracle that we looked at last week and his second recorded miracle that we look at tonight. After Jesus had turned the water into wine at the wedding in Cana, he went on a pretty extensive trip. We find Jesus going down to Jerusalem, where he cleanses the temple by running the money changers out of the temple. Then, during the Passover week, we're told by John that Jesus performed some unrecorded signs that began to get the attention of the people in Jerusalem. It even caught the attention of the religious establishment. One particular person to mention is Nicodemus. During this time of this Passover week and these signs that Jesus was doing, it caught Nicodemus' attention. And remember, Nicodemus was the one who came to Jesus by night, wanting to understand how to get into heaven. How do I enter into the kingdom of God? And Jesus told him, you've got to be born again. And Nicodemus struggled with that whole idea. How can I be born again? I got to go back in my mama's womb? That doesn't make sense. So that has taken place. And as Jesus later was baptizing some folks, John the Baptist is confronted by his own followers who question the fact that Jesus is baptizing and that some of John's own followers are now over there with Jesus. And John responds to these people questioning, and he declares and says, listen, that Jesus must increase, but I must decrease. It's time for me to step off the stage. It is his stage now. He is the one that must increase. Then after that, Jesus travels up to Samaria, where he meets an immoral woman at the well, and he offers this Samaritan woman eternal life. And she accepts his offer and goes back to the city and tells everyone what Jesus has done. Then, following a couple of days in Samaria, Jesus now returns back to Galilee, where he's going to meet a nobleman whose son is dying. And that's where we pick up in John chapter 4, verses 46 through 54. So look at that with me as we read this. John 4, verse 46. So Jesus came again to Cana of Galilee, where he made the water wine. And there was a certain nobleman whose son was sick at Capernaum. While he heard that Jesus had come out of Judea into Galilee, he went to him and implored him to come down and heal his son, for he was at the point of death. Then Jesus said to him, unless you people see signs and wonders, you will by no means believe. The nobleman said to him, Sir, come down before my child dies. And Jesus said to him, Go your way, your son lives. So the man believed the word that Jesus spoke to him, and he went his way. And as he was now going down, his servants met him and told him, saying, Your son lives. Then he inquired of them the hour when he got better, and they said to him, Yesterday, at the 7th hour, the fever left him. So the father knew that it was at the same hour in which Jesus said to him, Your son lives. And he himself believed, and his whole household. This again is the second sign Jesus did when he had come out of Judea into Galilee. Now, before we get too far into this miracle, let's clarify something about this miracle. There are some who have tried to say that this story in John of the nobleman's son is just another version of the healing of the centurion's servant that we find in Matthew chapter 8 and Luke chapter 7. In fact, there are some who would even use this to say that this is why we don't take the Bible literally. And I would tell them there are absolutely plenty of reasons in this story why we believe that this is a different healing than what we find in Matthew and Luke. And the reason they say it is because there are a lot of similarities between these two stories, between the two miracles of Jesus healing the centurion's servant and healing the nobleman's son. But there are enough differences between the two stories to help us realize that they are, in fact, two different miracles. Let me share with you quickly a few of these just so we can clarify and understand why these two events are different. In Matthew and Luke, it is the centurion, and the centurion was a Gentile. In John, the nobleman appears to be Jewish, from what we can gather. The centurion sought healing for his servant. The nobleman sought healing for his son. The centurion encounters Jesus in Capernaum. But the nobleman is from Capernaum, but he encounters Jesus in Cana. The centurion's servant is paralyzed. The nobleman's son has a fever. The centurion told Christ to stay where he was and simply speak the word and he would be healed. The nobleman wants Jesus to actually come to the house and heal his son. The centurion's faith was praised by Jesus. The nobleman and the others present with him were rebuked by Jesus. So there are some significant differences between the centurion and the nobleman. Too many for them to be the same miracle. Most people try to put the two together and say that John just changed some of the details. No. Yes, they both involve someone in Capernaum who needs to be healed, but the circumstances are just too different for it to be the same miracle. So, with that in mind, John tells us in verse 54 that this miracle is the second miracle. This is Jesus' second miracle in the Galilee area. The first miracle that we saw was associated with a wedding. It was associated with a time of festivity and joy. But this second miracle is associated with sickness. It's associated with a time of anxiety and sorrow. And ultimately, isn't that what life is? Life is a series of joys and sorrows. Isn't that really what life ends up kind of boiling down to? And by tying these two miracles together, I think Jesus is showing us something interesting. We need him in the moments of joy and happiness, and we need him in the times of sorrow and difficulty. We need him in both the joys and the sorrows. We need him in the good and the bad. We need him in all of life's circumstances. So, John, showing us this second miracle, introduces us to this unnamed nobleman. Who is this nobleman? It is generally believed and accepted by most scholars, based on the term used, that this man was someone who was in service to the king or tetrarch in the Galilee region. That would mean that this man held a high position, a high office in the service of Herod Antipas. His experience with Jesus is going to show us the journey of faith that this man took. And as we look at this miracle, I want you to notice how the faith of this nobleman changes. We're going to see his faith grow step by step throughout the narrative of this healing. And so that's what I want to gather and show to you from this tonight is this faith and how it grows. And so let's look at this. First thing that we're going to look at is the nobleman's crisis led him to a beginning faith. His crisis led him to a beginning faith. John chapter 4, look again, verses 46 and 47. So Jesus came again to Cana of Galilee, where he had made the water wine. And there was a certain nobleman whose son was sick at Capernaum. When he heard that Jesus had come out of Judea into Galilee, he went to him and implored him to come down and heal his son, for he was at the point of death. All right, so C.S. Lewis has said this. He said that God speaks to us in our health, but he shouts to us in our pain. And what an interesting statement. He speaks to us in our health, but he shouts to us in our pain. This nobleman is going through a moment of pain. It was a crisis in this nobleman's life that leads him into direct contact with Jesus. Let me show you a few things here under this point. First of all, we see that this nobleman had a desperate need. As we read verse 46, we're told simply that his son is sick. Well, listen, all of us, if you're a parent, we've all dealt with a child that is sick. It happens. Our children do get sick. But the plea of the nobleman shows just how dire the situation is. In a little bit, we read that his son is not just sick, his son is sick on the verge of death. Unfortunately, that is a truth that we all struggle with. It doesn't matter what our situation in life is, every single one of us suffers from the human condition. Sickness, disease, and death, it confronts each and every one of us. No one in this room is exempt. No matter who we are, the day will come when every single person needs help, because life and the events of this life are out of our control. For this nobleman, he is at the end of his rope. His son is about to die, and there is nothing he can do except for one thing. He heard about Jesus. He heard about Jesus. You can imagine as he sits by his son's bedside, someone comes in and tells him that Jesus has come back into Galilee, and he's just over in Cana. At this point, what we understand is he obviously had heard about Jesus. Maybe he's heard about the first miracle in Cana. I've got to believe that after that miracle took place at the wedding, that those servants that Jesus used to turn the water into wine, I've got to believe those servants started spreading the word and telling people, do you know what that man just did? He just turned this water into wine. I have no doubt that that began to spread. I have no doubt, and we read that there were people in the area who had been down in Jerusalem during the Passover week. That would have been expected. And all those people who were down there, they saw some of the works and signs that Jesus did while he was down in Jerusalem. And so when he heard Jesus had returned, he didn't ignore it. He didn't mock the people who told him about Jesus. And listen, before I make my next point, I just want us to take one note of this. He had to actually hear about Jesus. Listen, this is why it's so important for us as believers to tell other people about Jesus. They may reject us right up front, right? Ooh, goodness. They may reject us up front. They may not want to hear the message of Jesus. But every single one of us is going to face moments of crisis. And it's in those moments of crisis where hopefully they remember, wait a minute, I heard about somebody who can help me in my moment of need. His name is Jesus. And that's the point. He had heard about Jesus. He had never gone to Jesus. He had never done anything to try to find Jesus. But now he's desperate. And so he does the only thing he can do. He went to Jesus. It wasn't enough for him to have a desperate need. It wasn't enough just to have heard that Jesus was back in the area. No, now I know he's back in the area. I've got to go to Jesus. Perhaps as a nobleman with great resources, I imagine he had tried everything he could. I imagine that there were no doctors that could help. There was no miracle elixir that helped. Jesus was the only person he had heard about who could possibly do the impossible. But in order to get to Jesus, it was going to cost him. See, this is why a lot of people don't go to Jesus. Because there's a cost. with going to him. For this nobleman, there were three things about this that made it very difficult for him to make the decision to go and find Jesus. First, I didn't put this on your sheet. I was putting all these things on your sheet, but I took them off. There were three things that kind of happened here. First, in order to go to Jesus, that meant he had to leave his son, didn't he? He actually had to leave his son. How many of us would do what this man did? If you knew your child was dying, how many of us would leave their bedside knowing they might die while you're gone? Could we do that? Would we do it? See, the only reason he would leave his son is because he truly believed Jesus could actually help him. And that's what we gather from this. Listen, he went to Jesus. He believed Jesus could help his son. If he didn't believe it, he wouldn't have left his son's side. But we also see not only did he have to leave his son, he had to travel a full day's journey. It's one thing to leave your dying son's side to go across town and get the doctor, right? It's a whole nother matter to travel 20 to 25 miles to another town. For him, that was a full day on foot. Can you imagine with each step he takes on that day-long journey to go from Capernaum to Cana? Each step he begins to maybe question, and all he can think of is his dying son that he's left behind. I wonder if he just died. I wonder if he just died now. I wonder if I'll make it in time. You've got to believe this whole journey, that his mind was racked, his heart was aching. But the third thing about him going to Jesus is he had to let go of his pride. He had to let go of his pride. Remember, this is a man of high rank and position. And Jesus, who is this man Jesus? He's just a carpenter's son, right? He's just an itinerant preacher. He's a nobody. But this man who had a desperate need, this nobleman, he didn't let any of that stop him. He didn't let his pride get in the way of his belief. He didn't care what his fellow officials might think of him. When he finally got to Jesus, in spite of the crowd of people flocking to Jesus, this man confessed that he, one of the most important men in the land, he needed Jesus. He didn't just confess that he needed him. He literally begged Jesus for help. In fact, in the verse there where it says that he implored him. Implored is in the imperfect tense, meaning that he didn't just come and say, hey, Jesus, I need you to come and heal my son. No, the idea is that he kept begging and pleading over and over again. Imagine the crowd following Jesus wherever he was going in Cana. And as they're going, here's this man crying out over and over and over, Jesus, come to my house and heal my son. Jesus, come to my house and heal me. He doesn't stop. He doesn't let up. He just keeps begging over and over until Jesus finally stops. He had a beginning faith, but he had a much further to go. His faith had only just begun. Let's look at this second step of his faith. The Lord's response to his constant pleading and begging. The Lord's response to that led him next to a persistent faith. It led him to a persistent faith. Notice verses 48 and 49. Then Jesus said to him, unless you people see signs and wonders, you will by no means believe. And the nobleman said to him, sir, come down before my child dies. Looking at Jesus' response, it feels a little jarring, doesn't it? It feels like, where's the sympathy? Where's the care? Like, this doesn't sound like the Jesus we know. Here's this man wanting to save the life of his son. And Jesus says, unless you people see signs and wonders, you won't believe. But let's not forget the context of what's happening here. It's not just Jesus and this nobleman. This isn't a one-on-one conversation. There is a crowd around. Because when Jesus says, you people, keep in mind that for most of you, your translation, your Bible, let me look at it in mine. Notice people is italicized. That people is inserted there by the translators to help us understand that the word you is plural. So they put that in there to help us understand he's not talking just to the nobleman. He's talking to everyone there. So there's a crowd there. And Jesus is speaking not just to the nobleman, he's speaking to the whole crowd. A crowd of people who heard this man asking Jesus to perform a miracle. A crowd just waiting to see a miracle. So in part, this is directed at the crowd who just wanted to see a spectacle. But for the nobleman, Jesus is helping him to see two important lessons. The first lesson is this: faith required belief in his word alone. Notice how the nobleman wants Jesus to heal his son. What does he say? He says, "Come down and heal my son." I want you to understand that is the idea behind the phrase signs and wonders. When Jesus says, unless you people see signs and wonders. You see, understand in their culture, it was believed for those things to happen, for the signs and wonders to take place, that the person performing the miracle had to be present. So Jesus is ultimately not just rebuking the crowd, he's rebuking the nobleman. He's saying, so let me get this straight. Unless I come down and you actually see the signs and miracles in person, you won't believe? Is that what you're telling me? You see, this man made two mistakes in what is right now still a limited faith on his part. Understand, he limited his faith to life and death. Notice what he says, come down before my son dies, right? He says, he says, sir, come down before my child dies. He makes one assumption. Once my son dies, there's no chance of a miracle. Jesus is limited in what he can do. Once he's dead, it's over. Jesus can do nothing. And so the second mistake he made was he assumed Jesus had to be present for the healing to occur. He believed Jesus could heal him if he was there by his boy's side. But he didn't yet believe that Jesus could heal him from 20 miles away. That was unheard of. And Jesus is trying to help him understand that all he needs is Jesus' word. If Jesus says it, it's done. All it took was belief in what Jesus said. His power was available if he would simply believe Jesus' words. The second lesson he's teaching him, that we see here, and I think this is another part of it, his desperation led to a persistent determination. I think in some ways he wanted to, and Jesus knew what was going to happen, but is this not a test of the nobleman? Let me put you in your place for a moment. Let's see if you still want my help. The nobleman, he's not deterred by Jesus. He truly believes that Jesus is his only chance. He's desperate. Disaster has struck his family, and he believed Jesus is the only one that can help him. So he was determined not to give up after Jesus' response. And so he just keeps at it. Sir, come down before my child dies. Nothing stopped him from believing, and nothing stopped him from seeking Jesus' help. Even Jesus' rebuke couldn't stop the nobleman. The crowd couldn't stop him. He just kept asking until Jesus said yes. How many of us do that? How many of us keep asking and asking and asking and asking until Jesus finally says yes? Persistent determination. The next step in his faith now comes, where we see Jesus does say yes, and the nobleman's persistent faith turned into a trusting and obedient faith. His persistent faith turns into a trusting and obedient faith. Notice verse 50. Jesus said to him, "Go your way." Go ahead and go, because your son lives. So the man believed the word that Jesus spoke to him, and he went his way. Understand, Jesus' words were never intended to turn him away. Jesus isn't saying, "Will you just get out of my sight? Just go away. I'm done with you." That's not the idea here. His words are intended to turn the nobleman to Jesus in faith. Go your way, because your son lives. You can stop now. You can stop asking me. You can stop begging. I've done it. He's healed. Go back home. And how does the nobleman respond? So the man believed the word that Jesus spoke to him, and he went his way. Let me show you again a couple of things here. He immediately acted on his faith. The moment Jesus spoke, he believed. There's no argument. There's no more pleading. He doesn't say, no, Jesus, I really need you to come to the house. I don't believe you've done it. I need you to come to the house. No. He finally gets it. And so when Jesus says, "Go your way, your son lives," what's he do? I'm not going to argue. I'm not going to plead anymore. I'm going to believe. And by believing, he left Jesus, and he starts getting ready for the trip back home the next day. He acted on his faith. But secondly, we see that faith and obedience were both necessary. I truly believe this. If the nobleman had not been willing to accept and believe the word of Jesus, I don't think he would have ever received Jesus' help. He could have responded like many of us have. He could have said, "No, Jesus, I can't take you at your word. You have to be there to heal him. I need to see you heal him before I'll fully believe that you did it. Jesus, how can you possibly help him when you're so far away?" But the nobleman is done asking Jesus to do it his way. Jesus says the boy lives, and this nobleman chose to accept it and act upon it. Jesus said, "Go." He obeyed. All right, I'm going to do what you said. Now, he moves to the next step. And the nobleman's faith becomes a confirmed faith. He goes from a trusting and obedient faith to a confirmed faith. Verses 51 through 53. And as he was now going, his servants met him and told him, saying, "Your son lives." Then he inquired of them the hour when he got better. And they said to him, "Yesterday at the 7th hour the fever left him." So the father knew that it was at the same hour in which Jesus said to him, "Your son lives." All right, stop there for a moment. From the response of the servants, we learn that Jesus healed the boy at the 7th hour. Now, depending on which clock they were using, they had two ways of telling time. There was the Hellenist clock and there was the Roman clock. If it was the Hellenist, then that meant when Jesus healed his son, it was about 1 p.m. in the afternoon. If it was the Roman clock, it meant it was about 7 p.m. in the evening. Whichever one it was, it doesn't matter. Both of them mean it was too late in the day for this nobleman to make the trip all the way back to Capernaum in the daytime. And it was too dangerous to travel at night. And so this nobleman had to wait until the next day to go. So the next day, he's on his journey home. And the Bible says, as he was now going. Keep in mind, that tells us something important. It's the next day, and he is still in the act of obeying Jesus when he gets the news. He's still doing exactly what Jesus said. and his prayer has been answered. Belief and obedience brought the blessing. Both were essential. But his faith needed to move from simple belief to confirmation. And so he looks at his servants and listen, he believes, he knows they're not lying to him. And he knows Jesus healed his boy. But now comes the moment of truth. I want to confirm, I want to prove that my faith was real. That Jesus did that it was Jesus who did this. I don't think he had any doubt that it was Jesus that provided the healing. I believe he truly wanted to confirm what he knew to be true already. He could have lived the rest of his life believing Jesus had healed his son. But he had a desire to prove that there was substance to his faith. He wanted confirmation that no one could refute. And he was so full of joy and thankfulness to Jesus that he wanted to believe on him more than he already did. And so when they tell him the time that he began to heal, the Bible says he himself believed. His faith was made even more whole than it already was. Do you get what's happening here? He already believed Jesus. That's why the miracle took place. His faith allowed Jesus to give him the healing. But now he's taken it a whole nother step. By verifying and by saying and finding out that yes, the boy began to be healed the moment Jesus said it. Man, his faith is just 5 times stronger. Wouldn't it yours be? Wouldn't you walk away in so much confidence knowing, Jesus is the man. He's the guy. Listen, his faith grew, and this confirmation, it just added to his faith. And it led him to the final stage of faith. The nobleman's faith then became a witnessing faith. It became a witnessing faith. Notice again, verse 53. He receives confirmation. His faith is confirmed, and he himself believed. He believes even more. But what else happened? And his whole household. This again is the second sign Jesus did when he had come out of Judea into Galilee. Listen, this man went home, and he told his whole family what Jesus had done. He didn't let them just believe that the boy miraculously came back to life all on his own. No, he went back and he told them about his experience with Jesus. He told them about the word that Jesus gave him that his son lives. He told them about how Jesus instructed him to go, and in faith how he obeyed. And upon hearing from the nobleman the story of Jesus and his amazing work, they believed as well. Listen, I have no doubt that witnessing was not easy for this man. Remember, he is a well-respected, high-ranking individual. There is little doubt he would have faced ridicule for turning to this nobody named Jesus and then actually believing that this carpenter's son had somehow actually provided healing for his son. But he didn't let that stop him from making sure his whole house heard the truth. He made sure they knew that he loved Jesus for what Jesus had done for him. And he wanted others to know it too. See, I think the same thing should happen in our lives. We've turned to Jesus in faith. And when we have our faith grow to the point that it is confirmed in our lives, that we know the work Jesus did in our hearts and in our lives, it should automatically move us to a witnessing faith. I can't keep it to myself. I can't keep what Jesus has done to myself. I got to tell people. The nobleman had come to Jesus looking for a physical healing, but God gave him a spiritual healing as well. Today, as we look into the Scriptures, we place our trust and faith in Jesus. We too receive spiritual healing. Listen, eventually this young boy is still going to die. Everyone dies. Even faith healers die. The best thing a miracle can do is to delay the inevitable. But the saving of a soul is an eternal miracle. Now, I want to close out tonight by addressing one thing that comes up from this miracle. I want to address the modern day signs and wonders movement, which teaches that churches today should be characterized by healing, by words of knowledge, and by speaking in tongues. They believe that unbelievers they say that unbelievers would more readily believe the gospel message if it was accompanied by miraculous signs and wonders. Does that sound familiar? It's what the crowd wanted Jesus to do, right? They were there for the signs and wonders. We'll believe. Do a trick for us, Jesus, and we'll believe. The message of this movement is in direct contrast to what Jesus taught the nobleman and the crowd that was there. It's in direct contrast to what Jesus taught about those who sought after signs and wonders in his day. In the telling of this miracle, we see how he rebuked the crowd for being interested in miracles and not wanting to hear what these miracles signify. The cry of the crowd, "Show us a miracle," wasn't an indication of faith. It was an indication of unbelief. Now, the people in this movement today argue and say that there are signs and wonders all listed in the Bible, and that's true. But we need to remember that not every miracle in the Bible is attributed to God. When Moses came up against Pharaoh's magicians, for a while, those magicians matched Moses miracle for miracle, didn't they? Second, the evidence of the Bible reveals that the purpose of these miraculous gifts was to authenticate the message of Jesus and the apostles. By the end of the first century, with the death of the apostles and the completion of the New Testament, the purpose of the miracles had been fulfilled. Hebrews chapter 2, verses 3 through 4 says this, "Which at the first began to be spoken by the Lord, and was confirmed to us by those who heard him, God also bearing witness, both with signs and wonders, with various miracles." The grammar of this verse, very simply, suggests that the signs and wonders and the miracles, that it had all ceased by the time this letter was written. In other words, we heard from Jesus. We heard from those who saw Jesus. And God bore witness, past tense. God bore witness to them and to their message through signs and wonders and miracles. But that's not the way he's doing it today. He's doing it through his word. So I just kind of wanted to address that. Now next week, we are going to look as Jesus heals a demon-possessed man, all right? We get to look at Jesus healing a demon-possessed man. All right, thanks for coming, y'all, tonight. We're 5 minutes early. How about